And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
All right, first up here for the aviation segment, tomorrow's flying weather, showing some IFR up here over the north slope out to the eastern Arctic coast. Marginal VFR here along the Yukon River, and then IFR for the eastern, or for the western Alaska Range on the eastern slopes. IFR Southern Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, in across the Panhandle, and then marginal VFR here for the Gulf of Alaska, Kodiak Island, right across the Alaska Peninsula, covering much of the Bering Sea, but mostly VFR for the Aleutians, VFR for the Seward Peninsula, and the Chukchi Sea. For the afternoon, IFR becoming more widespread up for the North Slope and Arctic coastal areas. And better conditions here to the west, but still a lot of marginal VFR right through the strait into the Seward Peninsula, covering the central and eastern Bering Sea, right into the southwest interior, into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, down across the Alaska Peninsula. But out here for the central western Aleutians, VFR that way, and IFR for the North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle, gradually improving as you head south toward Dixon Entrance, and that next storm pushing IFR up to just along the east side of Kodiak Island and more extensive into the Gulf of Alaska. And then for Friday morning, that area kind of pulls up to the northwest here, northwestward, and breaks up with a band along the North Gulf Coast, another band here along the Aleutian Range into the western Alaska Range, and a third area out here over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, mostly Kuskokwim Bay up the river there to about the Kuskokwim Mountains, and an IFR holding for the North Slope and Arctic coast. Marginal VFR for the southeast coast and the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians, not too shabby. For the afternoon, still got an area of VFR out here over the south central Bering Sea, otherwise marginal VFR that extends right on up into the Chukchi, and IFR still for the North Slope Arctic coast, and also over the southwest interior. Not too bad here over the central part of the state from the NOAA Valley right on over into the 40-mile country, upper Tanana Valley areas and into the Yukon Flats. IFR here for the North Gulf Coast and in across the northern Panhandle. Passes for Anaktuvuk, marginal VFR for the day Thursday, same forecast for Adigan. Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR with the lowest conditions on the eastern entrances. Going marginal VFR for rainy and windy, looking marginal. Isabel, marginal. And Mintesta, VFR. Tanita, marginal VFR. And then for Portage, IFR, same forecast for Chilkoot and White, IFR for both passes. And looking at the freezing level, 2,000 feet here, Shelikof Strait across the Kenai Peninsula, up along the North Gulf Coast, 4,000 to 6,000 feet there for the southeast coast, 2,000 feet, well south of the Aleutians. And as far as icing goes, not much out west here, but with all the moisture coming from south to north here, especially that next system pulling a lot of moisture up, so quite an area of considerable moderate icing coming into the Gulf of Alaska, but staying east of Kodiak, and that pushing up toward the eastern North Gulf Coast and building along the north coast of the Panhandle. We'll see the jet stream here, south to north flow here, pushing all that moisture northward right into the eastern North Gulf Coast and then in across the Panhandle there with 110 knot winds into the southeastern Gulf of Alaska. And then back to the west, we've got northerlies out over the western Bering Sea into the west central Aleutians up to 85, 75 knots. 9,000 feet, this low tracking westward and weakening here, but holding together well enough to produce 45 knot southeast winds over the southwest interior. North to northwest, 45 to 50 knots there from the Pribilofs down across the eastern Aleutians. And a broad area of northerly flow out here over the Bering Sea, 35 to 45 knots. But the strongest winds here in advance of that front, 85 knot winds right off the north coast of the Panhandle. 3,000 feet, again in advance of that front, quite strong winds, 80 to 85 knots here along the north coast of the Panhandle, turning to an easterly direction, diminishing to about 55 knots there over Middleton Island, much lighter over the central and western interior. Then back out to the west, we've got a lot of Northeast winds at about 50 knots coming all the way down here across the eastern Aleutians. And with that turbulence, look for an area of considerable moderate turbulence with those northerly winds there from the northwest coast right on down to the Fox Islands and Alaska Peninsula. And then the other area with that next storm coming up and the very strong winds associated with that, producing considerable moderate turbulence from the Queen Charlottes all the way up along the North Gulf Coast and the southern Kenai Peninsula.